I want to give you a few heads up on the chapter on faith from McGrath's book, Theology of the Basics. One of the guiding questions is in this chapter is faith blind evidence, or does evidence inform faith? Now, there's this quote early on in the chapter where he quotes this guy named W.K. Clifford, who says, "It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything based upon insufficient evidence." In my mind, this raises a really interesting question. By what evidence does one, or by what criterion does one count evidence to be sufficient? So think about it for a second. What do you believe based upon insufficient evidence? I mean, couldn't the argument be made that most of us, if not all of us, believe almost everything based upon insufficient evidence? I can think of examples from history that I have a limited scope of what I know about history. Not because I don't read history. I do. I think history is fascinating. But I wasn't there. There are separate historians that can interpret one event and come to two radically different conclusions. Or even science. I am a firm believer in science, and I love the scientific community. But I'm not, an advanced biologist. There are certain things that I just simply don't know. And so, by what criterion does one count evidence to be sufficient? Now, we are all going to have different criterion by which we judge evidence to be sufficient. But it seems to me like this right here is one of the guiding questions of this chapter. In the first part of the chapter, he talks about ontology, which is the philosophical study of being. You are an ontological agent. You have being to you. And he's going to look at a couple a couple ontological arguments. And the question is going to be, can we, by reason, prove God's existence? And so in one of your assignments, you're going to read, or you're going to see one from St. Anselm. You're going to look, so be sure you know his. It's fairly interesting. But let me look at this question I ask you. Does his argument meet your criterion by which you judge evidence to be sufficient? You're also going to look at St. Thomas Aquinas' cosmological argument. But again, all of these arguments are trying to prove God's existence as an ontological agent. So you'll want to differentiate between Aquinas' cosmological argument and his teleological argument. And then I want to kind of conclude with some of these important thinkers. Number one, Pope John Paul II. What does he say about the relationship between faith and reason? Notice how what Martin Luther does in the chapter is he personalizes faith. He makes it where one trusts God and where one is united to God. And then the chapter concludes with a couple interesting thinkers. One is named John Polkinghorne. And again, he's trying to deal with this question of evidence. He says faith is not a question of shutting one's eyes or gritting one's teeth and believing the impossible. It involves a leap, but it's a leap into the light rather than in the darkness. A lot of times people are tempted to define faith as blind or as blind trust, where they put blinders on and they aren't exposed to the events of the world. But this chapter is trying to argue, and the Christian tradition has long argued, that faith is an eyes open activity. That it is involved, that it has reason, and that it is involved with what happens in the world. So the word trust is often how Christians have used to define the word faith. Now, right now, I am having trust in the chair that I'm sitting in. I'm having trust that this video is not as awkward as I think it is. We have trust in a lot of areas of life. I'm going to have trust in my car here in a little bit when I drive home. I'm going to have faith in it. And so he concludes this chapter by talking about the problem of evil. He looks particularly at Jürgen Moltmann and Alvin Plantinga. So be sure you're familiar with their arguments as to why bad things happen. Oftentimes God is blamed, perhaps erroneously, for these two things. So be sure you're good with Alvin Plantinga and Jürgen Moltmann. So the chapter is often really about faith, but it tries to argue that there is a better way in which we can define it rather than blind, or rather than being unexposed to the evidence around us.